very beautiful early fall or late summer afternoon, and the fact that you have nothing better to do than to attend a more or less academic lecture gives me great pleasure and is a first optimistic sign about the humanities. But I wanted to thank especially those who are responsible institutionally, intellectually for this colloquium, and this is in the first place my friend Georg Mein, for trusting me with this opening lecture. And I mean this seriously because I do know that this is not just a colloquium, one of those colloquia where I cannot find a topic. I mean, this is an urgent topic for the University of Luxembourg, the future of the humanities, and trusting me not only with a kind of permanent presence or reiterated presence here at the university over the past year, and trusting me with the lecture today is not anything I want to take for granted. I want to specifically thank you for asking me to do this, and thank you for trusting me that I can at least entertain you well enough to compensate for the sunshine outside during the 50 or 60 following minutes. I mean, I've been thinking for several decades now actively about the humanities, about their history, their present, and their future. But this is new, what I have to say today. Georg was saying I would be allowed to repeat things I've said in the past. This is new. This is the most comprehensive attempt that I have been putting together, thinking about the humanities. And as you will see, at least towards the end, it is relatively bold. I mean, this is something new, this is going to be provocative, but before I start praising myself, which is about the worst thing that any speaker can possibly do, let me really start. I want to start with the following sentence, and I mean it. There's so many signs today announcing almost empirically a possible end of the humanities, an ending of the humanities, a finitude of the humanities and arts, that to think seriously about this possibility that the humanities might really vanish during the next 30, 40, 50 years as an institution may have become a necessary condition for their survival. I think if one does not really face this possibility, we will not be able to produce any good thoughts about their survival. So I wanted to say that there's a typical lecture about the humanities that starts with some catastrophic news, blames them on the bad taste of ministries and administrators, and then said, but we are very glorious and everything is okay. So if you expect this type of lecture, you still have time to enjoy the Sunday afternoon. In a way, the tonality, the Stimmung of my lecture is rather gloomy, but maybe that is a good provocation for you during the next 3 days to find good enough reasons to be optimistic again about the future of the humanities, and I mean it. Now, let me start from a very American perspective. I was saying in my first sentence that there are many empirical reasons to believe that the humanities may not survive, that this is a real possibility. I mean, before I start with these American reasons, let me quote, and I will do that in German because I love to copy him, Niklas Luhmann, who would say not only about the humanities, jede Institution hat ihren historischen Anfang und wird deswegen auch ihr Ende haben. I mean, to think that the humanities will have an ending is nothing special. I mean, that's the fate of any institutions, like they have not been with Adam and Eve at the beginning of the world. But here are 3 empirical reasons. The first empirical reason is simply enrollments. Enrollments in the humanities worldwide are going down, at some places dramatically, at some places less dramatically. There may be local exceptions, but the humanities are not very popular among students today, period. Yeah? I mean, whichever way you interpret that. This is an empirical fact. In the second place, and I think plausibly, administrators worldwide, I mean, including universities that are as insanely wealthy as Harvard or Stanford, there's a tendency among university administrators to cut down positions and institutions within the humanities. And we humanists should not immediately say this is because they're stupid or because they don't have good intellectual taste. No, this is quite plausible. Plausible because enrollments are going down, so you react to that. Plausible also, I think, because we, the humanists, have failed to find convincing descriptions of what we have been doing or of what we might be doing in the future. There is also something like an uncertainty. Let me give you two examples. There is a certain productive uncertainty here at Luxembourg. I somehow have the impression that in the School of Humanities there are certain possibilities that have not been definitively defined yet, because one wants to find the right way of doing things. And this is, I think, different from a school of science, from a school of medicine, from a school of engineering. Or to give you an eminent case, the #1 academic institution on the continent, now you should all think whether you know what it is. It's by consensus of all rankings, the ETH Zurich. The Helvetian Technological University has always had humanities, but I've been involved in recent years in a discussion at the ETH to see whether this is still worthwhile and whether this is a good thing to do. And there is no antipathy at the ETH Zurich against the humanities, and they have a glorious history, but it's not clear what the humanities can be today. Finally, and this is the most American reason, levels of remuneration. Let me say that an assistant professor at Stanford, for example, and Stanford is actually, in average salaries, pays even better than Harvard's. We pride ourselves, or the professors pride themselves. This is the best paying university in the world. An assistant professor at Stanford University, and you know, an assistant professor in the United States is a young full professor, so to speak. He's not somebody's assistant. An assistant professor in the environment of Silicon Valley does simply not make enough money, even at Stanford, to sustain a 3-person family. If the spouse is not working and they have one child, you can simply not live on an assistant professor's salary in Silicon Valley. It is just not possible. You have to be wealthy, you have to have extra income, both spouses have to work, which is a good thing, but nevertheless, one salary is not enough to sustain a 3-head family on a very modest level. Secondly, and let me make the footnote that the University of Luxembourg, in my case at least, is a glorious exception. There is a general expectation in the humanities today, even more general than when I was 30 or 40 years old, that you do extra work for free. This is the only profession that I know where you're expected to give guest lectures, to do extra teaching, to do visiting professorships just for free. And sometimes you're not even compensated for your expenses, for traveling, hotel, etc., etc. I mean, I happen to be the son of 2 surgeons. To imagine that my father would have been invited to some place or by somebody to do surgery for free is pretty much unthinkable. And I think it is the only profession where you have this thing, oh, but it's an honor. Yeah? I mean, I constantly get invited with a compliment that this is an honor. And I normally answer, I will decide whether I find this is an honor or not. It is a strange phenomenon. Thirdly, and more empirically, in countries where scientific, quote unquote, publications are not subsidized publicly, like in Germany, for example, like in the United States, there are less and less manuscripts in the humanities, let alone dissertations, that ever make it to the level of becoming a book. Because it's just not worthwhile economically. You can't say, oh, that's the fall, or it's a positive consequence of the electronic age, but I think it shows that there is less and less money from outside the state within the humanities. Now, the best effort I can make in this situation to finally talk about what the humanities might be is historical. Although I will say at the end that maybe the historical worldview, which is the matrix of what I'm saying, has already disappeared. I'll try to go with you briefly through the history of the humanities, always pursuing the concept of end in the double meaning that Georg was referring to. End as a possible ending of the humanities, as a possible threat, and also in the sense that we might think that what we see leads to an end of the humanities. But and also in this very other, almost opposite sense of the objective, of the goal, of what might be the contribution of the humanities. And I believe, and this is something that I really never realized as much as in preparing this talk, that talking about what they are all about, talking about what their possible contribution might be, and has always been a weakness of the humanities, and maybe something that has been almost actively forgotten since their beginning. So it is difficult to say something about the end of the humanities. I think, Georg, it is not by coincidence that it was easier for two university presidents coming from engineering, like the case of the president of Michigan and Stanford, to say something about what the humanities might be all about, because they are observing them from outside. There seems to be almost a negative tradition from inside the humanities. No, we shouldn't think about that. The intrinsic value of what we are doing is so high, etc., etc. Now, the structure of this lecture will have 6 parts, and you might find this is shocking, because professors speak so long, and you will find that even more shocking as the first part will be the longest. But it will be altogether something like a quick step. Believe me, it is not going to be so horribly long, and I hope it is not so horribly boring. The 3 first parts are historical. I want to begin talking about the humanities avant la lettre in the literal sense of the word, because the concept of the humanities and arts, Geisteswissenschaften, Sciences Humaines, etc., etc., the idea of a cluster of disciplines that are different from the sciences is something that did not appear before the late 19th century. But I believe that there were a number of disciplines that transformed themselves, not programmatically, in the early 19th century in a way that made them different from the sciences. And this is what I want to describe as humanities avant la lettre. And as my field is literary studies, I will specifically focus on the early history of the literature, literary criticism, literary history in that time. This, paradoxically, this time of the humanities avant la lettre is what I think was the golden age of the humanities. You could almost say the moment that they started to think about themselves, this was all precarious. The second part would precisely be the late 19th century as a first moment of crisis of this golden age, and the moment where, in reaction to this first crisis, the humanities constituted themselves as a cluster of disciplines. I believe as a cluster of disciplines with a birth trauma, about which I will speak, and I will then give a brief short survey of the humanities' main movements in the 20th century, and arrive not at the conclusion, but the impression that after an explosion, a firework of new theories, of new initiatives, in the second half of the 20th century, the humanities have arrived at a situation of stagnation in the late 20th century. And that we are still in this situation of stagnation, and that without this stagnation, wouldn't do a colloquium on this topic with such a strong response. So this is the first half of the lecture. More in time, it's maybe 60–70%. In the second part, I firstly want to ask myself, so why did this stagnation happen? Does this stagnation have any symptomatic value? And I will produce an answer in reaction to this answer. In the fifth part, I'll try to give a description of what I think could be a goal, an end of the humanities today. Has not always been, perhaps, the end of the humanities. And this would be to cultivate a certain intellectual style, a style of thinking that I would like to describe as secular, and I underline secular contemplation. And I will end up bringing up a question to which I have no answer, important for deans and administrators. What might be the institutional framework, a different institutional form within which this secular contemplation could be cultivated, could be developed. Now, about the length of the lecture. I know that Georg is concerned about that. I'm always saying that, and it's always true. I speak from notes, but I hardly ever look at them. So that means the length of my lecture depends on your faces and the hermeneutics of your faces. If you look at me in this very neutral way, you have been looking at me during the first 6 or 7 minutes, it will probably last exactly 59 minutes. But now you started laughing and reacting, and that makes me loquacious. So then it would last 70 minutes. If, however, you look at me like my wife says many German audiences look at speakers, namely, that word is intranslatable, pumpy. I will feel embarrassed, I will skip things, and the lecture's going to be short. So if you decide to be pumpy, that is the best way to have a short lecture. Now, here are some reflections about three conditions about the emergence of the humanities avant la lettre. Yeah, this is important. I'm describing a transformation in some disciplines for which nobody had a program, that was not explicit, and yet I think they anticipated what the humanities would become explicitly as a cluster of disciplines in the late 19th century. I think a condition for this first impulse, let's talk about an impulse, a condition for this first impulse was a new social problem that had never existed before the bourgeois revolutions or bourgeois reforms. And this is a tension between the everyday experience in society and the normative image of society. A normative image of society had never existed in Western history before the bourgeois revolution and reforms. A concept like citoyen, citizen, that was also a bundle of promises, of things you had a right to expect did not exist before. Now, it would be easy for any historian to document that already in the first decade of the 19th century, a tension was felt between what had been promised and what the everyday reality was. You can all imagine that, right? I mean, you follow, most of you will have some historical knowledge about that. And my thesis would be that leisure, Freizeit, as a general right, not otium, a privilege of one class, emerged in the early 19th century in reaction to this tension. My thesis is that leisure, and a central part of leisure, much more than today, was literary reading in the early 19th century, that leisure was mediating between this normative image of society and everyday experience in society. Leisure would either, by compensation, mediate, by giving you in your leisure time what you were promised as a citizen but would not have in reality, or would just mediate by telling you, by convincing you that in reality the difference was not all that dramatic. So I think if we take into account that the first chairs for literary studies were institutionalized at German universities, not all over the nation that did not yet exist, but at Marburg, for example, in the 19-teen and at the 18-teens and 1820s, you could observe an emphasis on pedagogy of literature, on a pedagogy of literature, namely on developing ways of reading that would fulfill this mediating function. There was no awareness of this mediating function, but to describe, to tell people how to read mattered. And there was another function that became very important. I think literary scholars, right from the beginning, were trying to use literature in order to illustrate what the normative horizon, the normative image of society could be. Now this illustrating what the normative image of society could be happened under two different modalities. In countries that had emerged from a victorious, a successful bourgeois revolution, like England, like France, like to a certain degree the few universities then in the United States, the approach to illustrating by literature what the normative horizon could be was neither national nor historical. Matthew Arnold, who as the founder of literary studies in England has a role similar to the Grimm brothers, I quote him here, said, and he used to be a teacher at the secondary level before he became a professor at Oxford, we take literature from all nations and from all times as long as it is ethically valuable. Yeah, this is Matthew Arnold. In nations times, and Germany did not exist yet, like Germany, it was different, because you had to go back to the past. Think of the Grimm brothers. This was the same in Spain, for example, in order to find a positive image of society. So the medieval empire, in a way that maybe it had never existed, became a model for the present. And this is why in this other modality in Germany, for example, literary critics would go back to the past. They would develop certain skills like philology. They had right from the beginning an association with literary studies and being scientific. My point would be that this impulse towards literary studies, this impulse to deal with this new sphere of leisure, was a general impulse towards the humanities avant la lettre. But it happened under two institutional conditions. One institutional conditions that was not directly related to this impulse was the emergence of the historical worldview. I mean, this could be another long lecture series to talk about the emergence of the historical worldview, but let me give you one example. If you read in the first volume of Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie the article classique, in the first volume, 1753, you will be surprised. It does not say classique are those authors who are chronologically remote, but we read them as if they were close. Under classique, you find a list of 23 Latin and 18 Greek authors, and a very laconic commentary. These are the authors that we still use in the lycée to teach good style. I mean, we'd all say without me explaining, this is an absence of historical consciousness. This is not a historical worldview. I could say, however, that around 1800, and certainly around 1830, what had already emerged and became a key condition for the humanities was the historical worldview. The historical worldview as something that is itself historical. Reconstructing the historical worldview as a historical phenomenon is the converging point of the life work of who I consider the most important humanist in Germany in the second half of the 20th century, namely Reinhard Koselleck. Now, according to Koselleck, you can describe the historical worldview in 5 conditions. It is a worldview in which we always believe that once we have worked it through, we can leave the past behind, and the orientational value of the past is vanishing as we leave it behind. It is secondly a worldview in which we believe that the future is an open horizon of possibilities from which we can choose, that we can shape. It is thirdly a worldview in which between that past that we leave behind and that open horizon of possibilities that is the future, the present appears to be, and I quote Baudelaire from Peintre de la Vie Moderne, 1858, an imperceptibly short moment of transition. The present doesn't have any substance. And this short present becomes, in the fourth place, the epistemological place of the subject, of the human self-reference according to Descartes as a mind, because it is in the present that, basing itself on experience from the past, the subject chooses among the possibilities of the future. That is acting, that is action. This is the central part of what it is to be human. And finally, among conditions of the historical worldview, time is a necessary agent of change. Time is a necessary agent of change, not only in the sense that it necessarily changes phenomena. No phenomenon can resist transformation in time, but also in the sense that they are underlying regularities, laws of historical transformation that you might try to identify in order to prognosticate the future. So, I say secondly, beyond this first impulse towards the humanities emerge already in presence of the historical worldview. Maybe that is by coincidence, but what emerges as humanities always participates in the historical worldview. Finally, the early 19th century is an age where people start to think actively not only in Germany, about transforming the university. This is the origin of what we call today the modern university. I personally am such an admirer of Wilhelm von Humboldt that I run the risk of repeating something that I've already said in Luxembourg. I will briefly go back to the famous notes by Humboldt towards the foundation of a university at Berlin, which is the university that today we call, rightfully so, Humboldt University. In those notes, and if you have never read them in translation or the original, please read them. It is one of the more amazing texts, not only about the university, also written in an ecstatically beautiful German prose. And they were not written for publication. Humboldt has three main points. The first one is the most remarkable. He says, the university as an institution is exclusively dedicated to the innovation of knowledge. Transmission of knowledge is the task of the gymnasium. I know this sounds very unrealistic today, but remind us that this is the essence of the university. Innovation, not transmission, is important. Secondly, and if there's any representative of the state of Luxembourg here, please take a note. Humboldt says the university, the state, and he could not imagine a private university, has a double obligation with the university. It firstly has to nourish, he says, alimentieren, the university financially and well. And secondly, it has no right to ever intervene into any content questions of the university. Why? Because as soon as the state begins to formulate goals for the university, ends for the university, it can no longer be innovative. It will only fulfill what the state is already expecting. The most beautiful answer, however, is Humboldt's answer to the question, how and why can the university be a place of innovation? He says this has to do with the physical co-presence of the different intellectual temperament and tonality of different generations. Not only is the university a fruitful place because the students learn from the professor needs the less experienced but more enthusiastic, more passionate presence of his students so much, says Humboldt, that if a professor had no students, he would go out on the street, and I'm quoting literally, and invite them to come. He could not be intellectually innovative and productive without the presence of students. So these three components, this first impulse, the historical worldview, and thinking about the university become the condition for the golden age of the humanities in a century in which, as Wolfgang Iser, a much admired literary theorist, once said, the arts were progressively taking over the function that religion had been fulfilling until the 18th century. So the arts, literature become more and more the transcendental horizon of society, so that one could say, this is not Iser but me, because from time to time I have to say something that's original, one could say the humanities avant la lettre were the theology, the secular theology of the 19th century. And as such, they were unbelievably successful. Let me give you just one example. Glamowitz Möllendorf, not only the antagonist of Nietzsche, which is quoted these days, but also the most respected professor of classics, of classical philology in Germany, after the foundation of the Second German Empire in 1871, was taking turns with the emperor in giving the New Year's address to the nation. Could you imagine me taking turns with Trump in giving the New Year's address to the American nation, for example? Well, in the first place, I would not do that. But in the second place, I don't think it would ever cross Trump's mind to invite a humanist. Don't we agree on that? And this is not only about Trump. I mean, Obama would have not had this idea either. And I could hardly imagine for Frau Merkel. But just to give you an impression why I'm saying this was the golden age of the humanities. So, this was the longest and most narrative chapter, second chapter. But you don't smile so much, because if you smile so much, it gets longer. Second chapter, this golden age ended in a crisis towards the end of the 19th century. First of all, and this is a complicated philosophical question, this normative horizon of society, which had been taken for granted, all of a sudden became problematic. There were undercutting commentaries. Think of Nietzsche, for example. Nietzsche's discourse. He wouldn't have tolerated a normative description of society. More visibly, and secondly, the humanities that had never cared much about their end entered into a competition felt inferior to the sciences, which then in the late 19th century occupied a place rather similar to the present place occupied by engineering. Yeah? I mean, everything scientists invented, think of the invention of X-rays in my hometown in Würzburg, was immediately transformed into any type of practice. So there was sufficient reason for a philosopher who was at the same time dean at the University of Berlin, Dilthey, to propose to form a cluster of disciplines that he called Geisteswissenschaften. And there are similar movements at French universities, at universities all over Europe, sciences humaines. It is interesting, for example, that Stanford, which opened in 1891, so the youngest by far of the great American universities, completely copied the German university system, so when they thought about it in the late 1880s, but still founded a school of humanities and sciences. You get the point? They were not yet separated. And strangely, Stanford has always had, for 120 years now, a school of humanities and sciences. When I arrived at Stanford in 1989, everybody was apologizing that this was horrible that we had them together. Now, it is almost academically sexy. But you get my point. 1891, it was not obvious yet to separate institutionally the humanities and the sciences. The initiative of this separation, Dilthey is using the word Sezession, the initiative came from the humanities. And Dilthey's proposal was that the common denominator for the disciplines that could participate in the humanities was interpretation, attribution of meaning, as their central practice, as their central activity. Now, I believe that implicitly the humanities were born with a birth trauma, because the separation from the sciences that everybody was fascinated by, think of the early Nobel laureates, everybody knew their faces very different from today, around 1900, and the separation from the sciences, but also the concentration on interpretation gave the humanities a self-image that one could characterize, I'm using a word by Georg Lukács, by the young Georg Lukács, as Weltverlust. There was a loss of world in the humanities. I sometimes believe that this is the reason why until the present day so many of my colleagues absolutely want to become political or even be political. I say, if you want to be a politician, why didn't you choose a different profession? No, in the humanities, I think, you have this very, very strong obligation to compensate for this impression of a world loss. You could also say, and this is not only parodical or ironical, that from that moment on, a discussion about an ongoing discussion about the crisis of the humanities became so active that one might say that perhaps the humanities only survived the 20th century thanks to constantly talking about their own crisis. And as I'm looking at the former university president, my friend Jürgen Fohrmann, we all know that in the humanities we have colleagues who are specializing in the crisis discourse about the humanities. Okay, so bad starting conditions. Just some brief words about the history of the humanities in the 20th century. Nobody would doubt that the 1920s were a glory age. They were formed as a cluster. It wasn't quite clear where they would go, but this was a productive time of experimentation. I do think, however, that we could say, using a problematic mythological concept, that the original sin of the humanities happened in two faraway countries, in the Soviet Union and in Germany, under conditions of totalitarianism in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. In a way, one could say that the totalitarian states re-established that structure in which the humanities were asked to contribute to a normative image of society. And I will give you one horrible example of Germany, a book under the title Von deutscher Art in Wesen und Dichtung, about German essence in language and poetry. This was a book to which some of the most eminent Germanists of that time were contributing. It was a book put together for the officers who participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union by the German military. I don't think many of them had the time to read it during the Russian winter. But it was a book that was supposed to demonstrate wissenschaftlich, scientifically, the racial superiority of German culture. So this is the original sin. And we have similar, maybe not quite as aggressive phenomena under state socialism, state communism. Now, in reaction to that, the mid-20th century, the time of new criticism, in Germany, immanent interpretation, reading of philosophy without any philosophical projection, was a reaction to that. Time of abstention, late 1940s, 1950s. There's a beautiful book by Karl Löwit, a German Jewish immigrant, about meaning of history, about how meaning of history is necessarily related to totalitarianism, which is a very typical reaction of those years. But shortly after that, a somehow glory age of the humanities began, an explosion of new theories, for which very often literary criticism was the stage. I'm not saying literary criticism was more productive, but Derrida or Foucault, who were both not literary critics, I think made their international fortune by having a strong resonance in the humanities. So you could start by a new movement that was very much text-concentrated, structuralism, Lévi-Strauss, the rediscovery of Saussure that dominated from the late 50s and the 60s, then more context-oriented positions like neo-Marxism, neo-Freudianism, something like history of literary reception and not only literary reception. Then again, more text-concentrated epistemological deconstruction, neo-historicism, Foucauldian discourse analysis, and then again more context-oriented identity studies, media studies, which is very much what the Germans can call a German Sonderweg. But there were these 40 years where whenever you were in the humanities, you had to ask yourself, what's the new paradigm? There was always a new paradigm, and you always had the impression, I'm old enough to say that as a witness, or as a historical witness, you always felt behind. There was always something new. I believe that since the 1990s, this enormous explosivity of new theories has stopped. I'm not saying that the work that is done in the humanities today is not of higher quality. My impression is that the average quality intellectually of a dissertation today or habilitation is higher than in this theory age. But this explosivity, this optimism is gone. When you teach, for example, theories within the humanities today, you can safely stop in the 1990s. And I think it is quite interesting that we talk about turns now, spatial turn, etc., and no longer about paradigms. Something has come to an intellectual end. It is difficult to say what it is, or just look in my file cards what I thought it was. But I don't find any dramatic answers, so I think I can safely go to part 4 and to the second part of the lecture. Not so bad time-wise. I think another 20 minutes, that's okay, no? Yeah, so 20 minutes, if you can still do that. Yeah, Henning is too friendly, you know, that's dangerous. Okay, so why do I think we reach this situation? Of course, one could simply say this is the exhaustion of a discipline, and I'm not only saying this ironically, that has survived for 1 century talking about its own crisis. I mean, at some point that gets boring, and at some point it becomes difficult to recruit students. With that, I could also say, and this is more serious, the humanities were first emerging at a time at the European University where at a very low demographic level. When Humboldt was talking about a seminar, he imagined between 5 and 10 students, and this was realistic, where the university could really mostly be about innovation of knowledge and not about transmission of knowledge. I mean, today universities have become necessarily, and perhaps inevitably, institutions as the transmission of knowledge. But what I really believe is the main reason for this transformation and the main challenge of the humanities is a replacement, a substitution of the historical worldview, as I was describing it briefly after Koselleck, by a different type of temporality that dominates in our everyday and that has almost no connection with the humanities. You get my point. I believe that the humanities emerged and were shaped by the historical worldview. I believe, and I will dedicate the next 5 minutes to describing that today in our everyday we are living in an environment that is no longer historical, that this has come to an ending, and that therefore the humanities are in a different situation, that is to say the most positive thing, a huge challenge for them. Now let me do this contrast, and don't think about what you think when you are in your seminar, what you think when you are thinking politics. Think of your everyday. Think of early morning when you brush your teeth, or in my case, smoke your first cigarette. What is going on in your head? I think under conditions of what I will call the broad present, the future is no longer an open horizon of possibilities that we can shape. The future as we are experiencing it is a future filled with threats that come towards us, inevitably. Like global warming, like exhaustion of resources, like the demographic development. Unlike my president as an American citizen, I believe that these threats are real, but this is not even important whether they are real or not. We believe in them. We believe that this is the future. We don't see the future as a space to be shaped by our decisions. Secondly, I think for us, and this has much to do with the electronic technology, not exclusively, the past is not something we leave behind once we have worked it through. The past has turned into an aggressive past that is invading the present. I think this must be the same in Luxembourg or in your countries. There's no day today that is not officially a Memorial Day. There is no day of World War I, for example, in which all the major European newspapers in the electronic edition will not provide you footage. So the problem with the past is that we have too much of it. I'm not saying we have too much history. We have too much pastness, I like to say. Too much material from the past. Now this is very different from leaving the past behind. We cannot leave the past behind. And I would therefore say that between this congested future and this almost aggressive pastness, our present is by no means an imperceptibly short moment of transition. Our present is an ever-broadening present of simultaneities. Everything is in the present. Everything is simultaneous. It is an over-complex present of simultaneities in which we find no order. I'll come back to this topic, but is that clear? So between that future that is congested and the past that is invading the present, it is a present which contains everything, and that is too much. If you want to make an experiment, I always thought this was because I'm too old. I mean, this is September 11th today, very important date in world history and in American history. Well, 9/11 today. Tomorrow. That comes from traveling too much. Okay, tomorrow. That's good. That's in the congested future. I mean, I sometimes ask my students whether they can periodize the time elapsed since 9/11, and they normally say they can't. And we all know very dramatic technological changes, maybe political changes have happened ever since, but we somehow feel the time since 9/11 is one time. Once again, I mean, this is something for you to think about. When I first asked this question, I thought it was my old age. And I'm talking seriously. No, my students said, no, it's very difficult. Yeah? We don't have any clear incisions. That would be a symptom of the broad present. In the fourth place, if one could associate this imperceptibly short present of the historical worldview with a Cartesian self-reference, humans thinking about themselves as just and exclusively a mind, a consciousness, the fact that we are living in a different present might be an explanation of why today we have been desperately trying both intellectually and practically to reintegrate the body, the senses, the soma. I'm not necessarily saying we are successful with that, but disciplines like neurophilosophy or early morning jogging as opposed to smoking the first cigarette are such symptoms. So I think in this context, our relationship to our bodies are changing. And finally, clearly, this is what I found out talking to my students, time does no longer seem to be a necessary agent of change. We don't think it like that. So if we call that the broad present, then I have to make one commentary. It would be in the logic of the broad present that what preceded the broad present, namely the historical worldview, does not disappear. Yeah, the historical worldview is also part of this broad present. It is still around in certain pockets of our society or of our culture, in the humanities, for example. If you don't subscribe to the historical worldview, you will not get a PhD in the humanities, not even at Aarhus or at Luxembourg or at Stanford, although I would like that, but it doesn't work. You cannot think politically without believing in an open future. Nobody does. This is why the pre-election in Germany is so terribly boring. Yeah, you would need a Trump to make it more dramatic, I think. No, you don't want that. No. But you get my point. You cannot have democratic parliamentary elections without pretending that the future is an open future. But if I compare that to 30 years ago, nobody believes it really. Now, I want to focus for a moment to talk about this different environment. I mean, I'm always referring to the humanities. I want to focus for one moment on the present. So I've described this present as a present of simultaneities. Everything is in the present. Another way of describing the present would be this. The present throughout the 19th and early 20th century could be described as a field of, and I would like to say that in German, Kontingenz, because contingency has a slightly different meaning. I will now say contingency, but I mean Kontingenz. So that means most phenomena that we encounter have different perspectives, have different interpretations. We try with the historical worldview to transform them into one necessary interpretation. But they're always between certain things that we consider necessary, fate, we cannot change them, and other things that we can imagine but cannot associate with humans, they're impossible. I believe, and this is maybe, for me at least subjectively, my most important element in the description of the present, that we find ourselves in an age where these ends, things considered to be necessary and things considered to be impossible, are melting away, so that we are on our way from a field of contingents to a universe of contingents. Let me give you two examples. Traditionally, the sex, I'm not saying gender, into which you were born was considered to be necessary. Yeah? I mean, even if you were born as a hermaphrodite, you couldn't change that. That has dramatically changed. The best friend of my 8-year-old granddaughter Clara is Sabine, and Sabine is a girl, to put it this way, with male genitals. My granddaughter Clara knows about that. Everybody in the Bavarian, mind you, village that they're living knows about that. And everybody, including the local Catholic priest, is rooting for Sabine, because she has started the preparation at the University of Munich of a transsexual transformation surgery, etc., etc. This is fantastic. I mean, when I first heard the Christmas prayer, the priest including Sabine and wishing her luck, I mean, this is objective progress. It is absolutely amazing, but it also means that something that was fate, that used to be considered necessary, is transformed in an option. Yeah, I mean, Sabine's parents could have decided not to do this treatment with her. Yeah? They could have decided to keep it secret, so this is more liberty. Look at the end of the impossible. Huh? There were things that we could imagine but could not attribute to humans, like omnipresence, omniscience, almightiness, and especially eternity. Now, eternity we would attribute to transcendental beings because humans could not be eternal. But you know that at this point, eternal life has become a research project for medicine. Whether medicine will ever reach is a different question, but it can be imagined that one day it will be real. So the point I want to make is that I want to underline in the first place that this transformation of the everyday as a field of contingents into a universe of contingents is related to an unbelievable explosion of liberty. This makes our world better. But it could be at the same time that to live in a universe of contingents is too much, does not provide orientation. I believe that there is a very basic, and I would say in a way legitimate, desire to have things to hold on to. And I think this is the politically problematic but plausible reason for what we all and very arrogantly today call populism. I mean, and I promised the last time I'm going to mention him, the only way to explain that a majority of my fellow citizens voted for somebody like Trump, and I mean, you know, it's not just a national phenomenon, is precisely the simplicity of his early morning prosthetic Twitter messages. He gets up very early to go to the bathroom every morning. Being the son not only of two surgeons but two urologists, I know what it means if somebody gets up at 2 o'clock every morning. So, but the simplicity makes it. Because, I mean, it's completely incoherent, but every day people feel there is somebody who knows what to do, who knows what to go, where to go. So my point would be that this is a situation, this is a cultural and social situation with this enormous need for things to hold on to, where we in the humanities have lost all orientations, and we have to hide somewhere in our own world at the university, because this is where the historical worldview still dominates. But we have a very hard time to connect in any efficient way with the world outside. We can, of course, try to be critical, because we think if we are critical, we are heroic. But what would it be to be critical, for example, of the electronic world? Do we think that when we are critical of the electronic world, people will stop using Facebook tomorrow? Or that we don't want, you know, to pay with a credit card and being done electronically? I mean, you get my point. I mean, this criticism that we're doing today is not very efficient. It seems to be maybe self-satisfactory, but not much more. Now, what could be in the situation a successful, a positive survival strategy of the humanities? And it cannot just be a survival strategy. Yeah? I mean, I understand that for the younger generation, but for the older generation, we should face the fact maybe this operation will disappear. No, a survival strategy that makes the humanities worthwhile for the society. I will say in the first place, it cannot just be the continuity. We will do what we have always been doing, and it's been terribly successful and terribly worthwhile, and people just don't understand. That, I hope, will absolutely not work. Now, we should think about what has been the key strength of the humanities, and actually for that reflection, we find very good proposals. I'm going to quote a second time Niklas Luhmann, this time without copying it. Those who know him, remember him, know that I'm doing a good job copying him, I believe, with this very strange voice that we had and this Lüneburg accent that he has. Luhmann said, and he did not only say this about the humanities, but I want to narrow it down about the humanities. If most social systems have the function of reducing complexity in the environment, and that always means reduction of complexity, always means to find solutions, The task of, as he calls it, the scientific system, and I believe this is particularly true for the humanities, the task is not to reduce complexity, to find solutions, but to increase complexity. So to put it very dramatically, you could say the task, or maybe not the task or the end, but the best tradition of the humanities was to make our worldview more complex. Because if you have a more complex worldview, you have more alternatives, you have more ways of describing and of analyzing. Only if we are already in this universe of contingents, in an environment that we are exposed to over complexity, I somehow feel this recipe by Luhmann, which I admire, does not quite work for today. I'm talking 2017, I'm not talking Luhmann's time 20 years ago. So I would like to slightly modify that and say, perhaps it should not be the end of the humanities, and I think this is what Hennessy and his colleague were referring to. Hennessy was also saying, in a more Californian way, more simply, asked by the New York Times what the former Stanford president, why he believes in the humanities, and he gave a very brief and good answer, and this is where I'm going now. The university would not be an intellectual place without the humanities. Yeah? It would be a place of a production of recipes, but only by this institution that increases complexity, it becomes an intellectual place. But what would be this specific way of thinking, the style of thinking that the humanities are good about? John Hennessy would have said, and I hadn't planned to mention Hennessy, but as Georg mentioned him, John Hennessy would have said the humanities are good at thinking outside the box, thinking in a different way, thinking in a way that other people do not think. I call that riskful thinking, and I will briefly explain, some of you know this concept already, why I call it riskful thinking. So my point would be, an end of the humanities today would be to cultivate within the university and within society the style of riskful thinking. I will then say what that could be. I gave you one example, some of you know this example already, but it is so beautiful for what I consider to be riskful thinking that it is worth repeating it for those among you who do not know it. The example is from Jacques Derrida's first visiting professorship in Germany in 1988 at the University of Siegen, of all places. Pretty unlikely, but it is true, historically true. I have never been a great follower of Derrida. I admired him intellectually, but I've never been of the school or the chapelle, as they were saying in France, of deconstruction. So Derrida teaches at Siegen. The year 1988 was, as every other year in Germany, a Heidegger crisis year. So I think there's a binary rhythm in Germany that either Heidegger crisis years or years without a Heidegger crisis. 1988 was a Heidegger crisis year, and Derrida, as always, was talking without making any commentary, taken for granted, of Heidegger as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And the century was still going on. And very politely and modestly, a Siegen student with his heavy Siegen dialect interrupted him and said, "Professor Derrida," Derrida understood German, "how can you say that Heidegger was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century if he was a member of the Nazi Party?" And Derrida's answer was spellbinding, beautiful, and at the same time, my best example for riskful thinking. He said, "Mon cher jeune ami, of course I know that Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. That is not a question. The only worthwhile question is whether he could have become the greatest philosopher of the 20th century without being a member of the Nazi Party." Get my point? That would be riskful thinking. Derrida said immediately, and subsequently wrote about it, that he was passionately hoping that the answer was no, that Derrida would have become an even better philosopher without being a member of the Nazi Party. But there has to be one social institution where even this question or other questions can be asked. And it is because of the effect of such questions that I believe that what is normally criticized by humanists, the ivory tower, is a good thing. If the university would not be at some distance from the society, if everything that we are discussing here would be immediately covered, be on TV, on Facebook, etc., etc., it could not be a place of riskful thinking. Now, if I'm asking myself, what would be a form of riskful thinking? A thinking that would be not necessarily critical in the way of being pumpy with everything, in the way of undermining everything, but trying to be a different style of thinking. Under present day conditions, I arrive at the concept of contemplation. I have always been skeptical about the concept of science for the Geisteswissenschaften. I mean, part of that being that I've been living for almost 3 decades under Anglo-American conditions where, as you know, a word like literary science is just an oxymoron. You cannot say literary science, you can say literary history, literary criticism, literary theory, and you could also not say sciences of the spirit. I mean, people would think that's a lunatic concept. But I mean, I'm not saying that the Anglo-American world has to be normative. Why do I think it should not be science? Well, firstly, because the humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften as a cluster emerged out of this differentiation with the sciences. So I think instead of constantly talking about our research, constantly trying to be scientific, we should think of how we are different from the sciences. Secondly, I believe that this technological environment, talk of the universe of contingency that we all try to like to criticize so much, is of course talk of Silicon Valley, is permeated, and for the better, by a scientific mentality, by a scientific mind frame. So we should try to think in a different way. Now, what would secular contemplation be? I say secular contemplation to eliminate the potential theological association. I admire theology. I actually studied Catholic theology without finishing myself, not for existential reasons, but for intellectual reasons. But I want to avoid to say, oh, this is just, you know, this is a kind of Zen Buddhism or something like that. What would contemplation be? Contemplation would be, in the first place, a much required capacity in our cultural environment, the capacity to concentrate on phenomena. The capacity to concentrate on phenomena. It would be, in the second place, the capacity and the freedom to return to certain phenomena. That you're not obliged to say, now I have dealt with Goethe's Faust, and now I move on to something else. No, we do not, I mean, we can dwell on certain topics. I think this is a perfectly legitimate way of thinking. I mean, somebody like Wolfgang Iser, or probably Jürgen Fuhrmann knows him, one of the greater living literary critics, Luis Costa Lima from Brazil, have focused their entire life basically on one topic, fiction in Iser's case, mimesis in Costa Lima's case, and that was unbelievably productive. I'm the opposite, but I think this is very legitimate to reiterate. And by reiteration, an ongoing production of complexity that, very importantly, is non-teleological. Yeah? This is open-ended. You can always produce more complexity. This type of contemplation is what I think we should go for. To cultivate contemplation would be our end at the Humanities today. That is my proposal, but I'm not finished yet, 5 more minutes. In the first place, I think this can only happen in small groups and in groups of real presence. This is not something you can teach students, this is something that you learn by doing. This has to be in small groups of real presence. This is not transmission of knowledge. This cannot be downloaded. And therefore, it is expensive. If you want to do the humanities in an efficient way, it is certainly expensive, and I think it has to be in co-presence of different generations, like what Humboldt is saying. Yeah? Not every teacher has to be as stone old as I am, but to emphasize the generation difference instead of constantly trying, as it is the law of our time, to be young is important. Not to tell stories from the past, as I've been doing today, but to emphasize different styles, the co-presence of different intellectual styles. This is what makes the humanities. Now, if what I have been saying in the last 10 minutes has any appeal for you, the question would be, how could one institutionalize that? I mean, this is a question for this colloquium, and this is a question for any university, and this is a question I've never thought about, because I've been lucky enough to never have any administrative position. I mean, that shows the wisdom of the universities. They knew it would have been catastrophic to ever have me as a dean or something like that. So I've never had to think about such questions. But now, due to Luxembourg and due to this lecture, I did think about it. My first answer is this: exercising, practicing secular contemplation will not function within just the continuity of the present institutional shape. I mean, if you just continue the humanities like this, this may remain a side effect, but it will not become more central. My intuition, actually, what I have to propose, comes from a very different context in which I had reason to ask a student of statistics at Stanford to give me an answer, I mean being paid for it, to give me an answer with research to the following question. Which among the 50 world ranking of universities, and she told me that at least 50 of the existing 240 world rankings are quite seriously from a statistical point of view. And I think I mean, of course, most universities say rankings are nothing worth because they're ranked very lowly. If you come from Stanford, you have to think rankings are very, very good because we always do really well. Anyway, this was not my question. My question to her was, is there a type of university that was the most successful in the past 25 years in the international rankings? So those who have risen the most in the past 25 years. And the answer was absolutely coherent. She had no expectation what I was expecting. The answer was very coherent. These are universities that are, as you would say in German, the TU type, the technical university type, whether they have that name or not, under the condition that they have humanities. So there are universities, very good technical universities, have no humanities. They are not, for example, the ETH, the ETH is the continental university that has risen by far the most, and it is now followed by the ETH Lausanne, the other institution of that kind. MIT, but also Stanford, which doesn't have technology in its name, but Stanford is something like MIT, but those universities that are concentrated more actually on engineering than on sciences, with very strong sciences, but in presence of the humanities, are the universities that have the greatest success. Why is this the case? I have no systematic answer for that, but I will finish, if you want, with a Stanford story. It's more than an anecdote from the present. About 5 years ago, the computer science department at Stanford, and I mean probably everybody knows that the electronic industry technology emerged out of Stanford. And the computer science department, our emblematically strong computer science department, approached the lowly and modest literature department, not all humanities departments at Stanford, asking whether we would be willing to do a double major with them. Now, is everybody familiar with what a double major in the American university system is? All undergraduates have to have at least one major, one area of concentration within which is a studium generale, that's college. A double major is for the better students. I mean, the very good students do a double major or major minor, one main concentration and one secondary concentration. So to our great surprise, computer science asks us whether we would be willing to do double major with them. So students would have as the first area of concentration or one area of concentration computer science, and then any type of literature, French, German, comparative literature, could also be philosophy, so they would have a double major. So I will admit that I was the only literature faculty, the only literature profession that in the vote on that abstained. I wanted to vote against, but I didn't really dare. All my colleagues agreed enthusiastically because I wanted to be kritisch. As you write, I always write that in German with double T, kritisch. I didn't want us to be transformed into the pleasant foregarden of computer science at Stanford. But here I stand, and I stand, as we say in American English, here I stand corrected. This has been an absolutely huge success. Not a success in the sense that this is a terribly popular double major. I mean, there's sufficient students who do that to make it interesting, but in the sense that our computer science colleagues tell us our best students in computer science want to do a double major, and more importantly, not for relaxation, not because they also want to read literature, but because they believe that it is absolutely crucial for them. It makes them better engineers to do humanities. And here's one final example. A young student, a sophomore, 17 years old, approaches me last trimester at Stanford and asks me, can we do an independent reading on the late Heidegger with me? So independent reading means this is expensive. You meet with a professor 1 hour every week during the trimester. We have trimesters, and discuss a syllabus, a list of readings. So we had a list of reading of the late Heidegger, and I said, Sam, it's okay, I can do that with you, but why are you interested in the late Heidegger? And says to me, because I have the intuition it would make me more aware of what my programming, I mean, you say writing code in American English, is all about. So we did this independent reading, and I left this independent reading for the first time in my life, thanks to Sam, with an intuition of what it is as an intellectual operation to write code, to program. And I also understood why he believed that Heidegger was so useful for that. The reason is actually that he believes, and he's not the only one who believes it, that writing code is completely intuitive. So that your fingers, and this is not only metaphorically, your fingers are always ahead of your mind. Huh? You will only 10 seconds after you will realize what you have been doing. It is not problem solution oriented. You have to let go. And there is of course a motif, especially in the late Heidegger, of that. Gelassenheit, serenity, the capacity of unconcealment of being something shows itself to you, and this is not your activity. So I think that's what Sam tells me. And me, being the least technological person of my generation, made a contribution to him writing code even more successfully. Meanwhile, Google has offered him 25 million for a startup, but he says he wants to finish first. So this is an unbelievably talented young man, and I learned what programming, of course I cannot program, but I have an impression what this is as an intellectual operation. And don't say this can only happen at Stanford. I think it can happen everywhere, but how can it function? Here are my very, very basic ideas. It would function if, like at the Hochschule St. Gallen, one of the more successful business schools in Europe, there was a small humanities faculty, and everybody who wants to become whatever at St. Gallen, wants to graduate from St. Gallen, has to take a certain number of humanities classes. There is no specific program. It doesn't have to be literature or philosophy or musicology. Let's say 3 or 4 humanities classes during 6 years of studies. So no specific content, just humanities classes. Secondly, not humanities classes necessarily that try to think through technology or business. That could also happen. No, humanities classes about Plato, about medieval philosophy, about medieval literature, about anything. It is just about this different style of thinking. What would the humanities schools look like? I think maybe it would be enough to just have a school of humanities, and I have to say, once all of you have tenure job, lifetime jobs, all of you are here present, I think we should have less humanists worldwide. Maybe we have too many, and this, I know this is very provocative and problematic to say, and this is a burden for the discipline. It could be small departments, like the departments of MIT, like the departments at ETH, but very efficient. And finally, we should have small programs for future teachers in the humanities. At this point, everybody who is doing a curriculum in the humanities fictionally will end up with a profession in the humanities, and we all know that there are not sufficiently jobs for that. So that can somehow not function. So my proposal would be that most of our activity in teaching would precisely be on the side of teaching people who are not mainly students in the humanities, hauptamtlich humanities students, and that we would only have a small group, and then we should look statistically, so to keep the humanities as a profession alive. Will that be possible? I mean, if you all agree this would be a good idea, would that be possible? I'm not so certain. I would like to know what the Luxembourg colleagues from the administration think about it. But I think it is not impossible, and as I started with empirical data from the United States to document that the end of the humanities may be real, I'd like to end with two uncommented empirical dates that make you optimistic. All of a sudden, and there's no real explanation, but I find it interesting, in one field of the humanities, the top salaries in the US have jumped up. So there are several philosophers, and I will say the number, several philosophers in the United States who are making about $500,000 salary per year. Yeah, nobody has really explained that, nobody has an explanation, but it proves, so philosophers, unfortunately not me, it proves that there is an appreciation, a practical appreciation. It matters to have good philosophers at your university. Secondly, and that is our greatest surprise, about 30% of our doctorate students, I mean, who end up with a doctorate at Stanford University, are being absorbed these days positively by Silicon Valley. So when we observed that, we had a colloquium with Silicon Valley representatives, some of them very eminent, and we asked them, can you really tell why you hire humanists? In the first place, they didn't even know that. They just said, we hire people whom we find interesting in the job interviews. So the specific craft of writing code they will learn here at Google or at Oracle, but they're interesting people, and that's why we're paying them well. So, you know, a little bit like parents when their children are successful, I'd like to end this talk by saying that sometimes we do something right in the humanities. And I think this is precisely cultivating this art of secular contemplation, and therefore it is my proposal that we focus on that. I thank you all for your truly angelical patience.